Thank you, Elizabeth, for that magnificent talk. Our next speaker is Professor James Fenton, celebrated poet, journalist, and critic, educated at Magdalen College, Oxford University, where he won the Newdigate Prize for Poetry. Professor Fenton has also worked as a political journalist, drama critic, exhibition and book reviewer, war correspondent, foreign correspondent, and newspaper columnist. He has written widely and probingly about art and the history of art. A fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, he was appointed professor of poetry at Oxford University from 1994 to 1997 and was awarded the Queen's Gold Medal for Poetry in 2007. His poetry collections include Terminal Moraine in 1972, The Memory of War Poems 1968 to 1982, Children in Exile in 1983, and Out of Danger in 1993. Professor Fenton has written several books of nonfiction, including my favorite, Leonardo's Nephew, Essays on Art and Artists of 1998. And I also highlight here All the Wrong Places, Adrift in the Politics of Asia in 1988, A Garden from 100 Packets of Seeds in 2001, The Strength of Poetry in 2001, as well as an introduction to English poetry in 2002. Professor Fenton has translated 2 operas, Verdi's Rigoletto in 1982 and Verdi's Simon Boccanegra in 1985 for the English National Opera. His libretto from Salman Rushdie's Harun and the Sea of Stories was performed in the New York City Opera in 2003, and in 2004, his translation of Tirso de Molina's Tamar's Revenge was performed by the Royal Shakespeare Company. Several of his books were published in 2006. His collection selected poems, his illustrated history of the Academy entitled School of Genius, his editions, the New Faber Book of Love Poems, as well as Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He's as close to a polymath as I know. I rely here on the apt words of Ian McEwan, and I quote, "There is a strong case to be made that James Fenton is the finest poet writing in English. His technical virtuosity is beyond doubt. He has written some of the most beautiful love poems of our times," end of quote. Please join me in welcoming Professor James Fenton. The title of his talk is Bronzino, Painter, Poet, and Man.
Thank you very much, Carmen. And it's a great pleasure to have some small part to play in this extraordinary event, this first exhibition devoted to Bronzino. Some people claim to have found Bronzino as a painter to be remote, glacial, and puzzling. But for my part, the chief difficulty is to understand this kind of talk. The Uffizi portraits that we've just been looking at, Eleanor of Toledo in her astonishing dress, in which she was eventually buried, her husband, Cosimo de' Medici, and his children, beginning with Bia, his bastard daughter, the court favorite who died young, with her tiny braids along her domed brow, and that smiling, chubby, legitimate Giovanni holding a goldfinch. One would think that these were the easiest paintings in the world to respond to with simple affection and delight. They form a group, a court, just as Holbein's drawings taken together form a court, as do the portraits of Velázquez. And to consider them as a group is to enjoy them all the more, unless, of course, what is secretly holding them back is the very fact that they constitute a court, and that this court was the court that finally buried the Florentine Republic. Certainly, Bronzino was a court painter, with all the loyalty that implies. And certainly what this group of portraits sets forth as a group is the triumph of a dynasty. But it seems far-fetched to suppose that when we contemplate this triumph, we subliminally channel the furious resentments of the Florentine exiles of the 16th century, that we look at Cosimo and think, "You murdered my uncle, you tortured my brother, die, tyrant, die." What is quite possible, I suppose, is that we've picked up or inherited some of this anti-Cosimo sentiment from writers of the 19th and the early 20th century, for whom the triumph of the Medici dukes did indeed set its seal on Florentine decline, or the decline of the thing that they most admired about Florence. Or for whom what we're talking about is the last of the Renaissance. After Michelangelo, the rot sets in. I'll give one example of this sort of art historical writing that I simply do not understand, and it's not complicated. Everything I'm going to say is on the level of the blindingly obvious, I hope. It comes from the foreword to Charles McCorquodale's monograph of 1981, which I see has been being sold here. Moved to explain the paucity of the literature on Bronzino, McCorquodale says, "Bronzino's not an easy artist to understand and still less easy to explain. The little of his personality which emerges from his paintings, poetry, letters, and other contemporary documents is not especially inspiring. Unexpectedly, in view of his cold, calculated style, the one feature which remains constant throughout all accounts of him is his warmth and kindness to others, notably Pontormo." So, according to McCorquodale, everyone says Bronzino was warm and kind, and this, to the art historian, is uninspiring. We learn next that Bronzino's contemporaries had a fundamentally different attitude from our own. Quotes, Vasari, for example, repeatedly praises his portraits because they're so lifelike, the very quality we regard as most lacking. I think of that young man Lorenzo Lenzi, and imagine how one could say that that is not a lifelike portrait. Finally, the evidence is that Bronzino's character was simple and straightforward. It was McCorquodale again, tinged neither with Pontormo's neuroticism, Parmigianino's madness, nor Titian's driving ambition. For us, Bronzino's personality remains, in Ronald Furbank's word, unglimpsable. Well, we've already had one glimpse of that personality. We've been told that by general consent, it was warm, simple, straightforward, and kind to others, notably to Pontormo. Pontormo, who, great man though he was, could be very demanding. But Pontormo had been Bronzino's teacher, and Bronzino stayed loyal, dining regularly with the crazy old recluse, mostly on Sundays. We know what they ate. Or at least we know what Pontormo ate, because his amazing diary tells us. Quotes, Monday, a small boiled kidney from a good lamb. Tuesday, 2 fried eggs and a salad. Wednesday, but Wednesday's a blank. Thursday, 4 quattrini, that means 4 farthings, 4 small coins. 4 quattrini of bread, a salad, some badly cooked boiled lamb. On 13th Friday night, I had cooked chicory, 4 quattrini of bread, and an omelette. Saturday night, but Saturday night is another blank. Sunday night, I had some boiled lamb and cold-cooked greens and cheese. A couple more days pass unrecorded. Then Wednesday, the 23rd of May, I had some meat for supper. Thursday, Corpus Christi, I had dinner with Bronzino. I had some Greek wine. The editor of my edition says, sweet white wine, probably a regional Italian variety. I wonder whether that's true. Why would he call a regional Italian variety Greek? Anyway, so I had some Greek wine, meat and fish, and at night I had an ounce of cake with a little meat and with little appetite. Okay, it's not much of a glimpse of Bronzino, and we don't even learn for sure what he ate. But in context, we can see that the meal was liable to be marginally more festive when the younger man was around. 2 meat dishes instead of 1. Sunday, I had dinner and supper with Bronzo. He calls him Bronzo or Bro. Bronzo. Blood pudding and slices of liver. Pork. That's blood pudding and liver in the middle of the day and pork in the evening. Not much sign of pasta, by the way, unless occasionally some vermicelli. Bread, often rosemary bread, sounds rather nice, was a regular source of carbohydrate, and Pontormo would eat 10 ounces of it a day with meat or eggs or an endive or a borage flour salad. Not a bad diet, perhaps, however grim it looks in the diary. What did they talk about? Unfortunately, that's not what Pontormo was interested in recording. He goes on about what he ate, about his ailments, and about how his studio assistant, Battista Naldini, is behaving badly. Quotes, "At night I was uneasy, waiting for the meat, because Battista was off, and it's the first time he hasn't slept here. And when his father was sick, he didn't stay with him. And this time it's because he has a bed to sleep in at Rotella's." Pontormo succumbs to diarrhea. "Wednesday, I was worse, so that about 10 times or more at every hour I had to go. So I stayed home and had a little soup. My Battista went out that night, and he knew I was sick, and he didn't come back. Something I mean to remember always." On the 16th of Tuesday, I started a figure, and at night I ate a little meat, and that did me little good, since Battista had said that I would have to manage for myself because he'd been scolded for no reason. Next entry, "I had supper with Bronzino, and my throat hurts so much I can't swallow. And Battista didn't come back, and that day I put up the cartoon that Battista had brought. I was left to do this job by myself. Sunday the 5th of October, Battista went to Poggio, and at night I ate only innards, and with a good appetite, and my teeth still hurt. On Friday the 13th, I had supper by myself and started to manage on my own, and Battista locked himself in his room. Friday night, I had fish for supper with Piero, and Battista left the note which said he wasn't coming back, and that was when he borrowed the fishnet." This mysterious "he borrowed the fishnet," which may be some kind of Renaissance idiom for getting the hell out, marks the last time we encounter Naldini in the diary, which ends during the last months of Pontormo's life. However, the likelihood is that relations were patched up, because when Pontormo died, he left all his drawings and clay models in his studio to Naldini, who, however, failed to inherit them because Pontormo's relatives stepped in and preempted him in court. Pontormo records which bit of his frescoes he's working on, and he makes tiny drawings of each giornata, each day's work on the fresco, which is very interesting, and would be more so had the frescoes in question not been destroyed. But we cannot look to the diary for enlightening remarks about the art. Secretive in life about his painting, he does not open up for us posthumously. But he does moan about the weather, and so we can only assume that most of the time this is what Bronzino had to listen to. And he was an expert at listening to Pontormo, no one more so, since he had, as a boy, done exactly the job that Naldini was now doing, starting at roughly the same age, which in Naldini's case was 12. Pontormo was particularly alarmed by damp weather, as during a time when it rained every day for a month, and the doors swelled up and the walls became damp and gave rise to a terrible sort of catarrh, which could kill you suddenly if you were careless about exercise or your clothes or coitus, or a superfluity of eating. Michelangelo shared this belief that coitus was or could be bad for you. Avoid it as much as possible, he said, if you want to live a long life. And perhaps this was a quite commonly held theory. After all, Raphael was supposed to have died of an excess of it. Pontormo records that one Sunday in 1556, Bronzino knocked at his door, and then during the day, Daniello, I don't know what they wanted. In other words, that day he wasn't answering the door. Vasari tells us about his house that Pontormo had a chamber which was only accessible by a ladder, and that when he retired to his chamber, he drew up the ladder after him by means of a pulley. Clearly, he was a depressive. A few days after he failed to answer to Bronzino, he tells us, Sunday, Bronzino, Daniello, and Ottaviano came to the house, and I bought reeds and willow sticks for the garden. And Bronzino wanted me to have dinner, and he got upset and said to me, "It's as though you were coming to your enemy's house," and he left me. This contemporary record of Bronzino's exasperation and hurt feelings, by Pontormo himself no less, wonderfully corroborates the impression that McCorquodale received from the documentation as a whole, that Bronzino was a nice man and a good friend, for he couldn't bear to see Pontormo making life gloomy for himself. It's a glimpse, no more, but what a reliable and what a valuable glimpse. Bronzino was a poet and a keen reader of poetry. He's said by Vasari to have known all Dante and Petrarch by heart. On 27 January 1555, Pontormo records that he had dinner and supper at Bronzino's, and Alessandra came to dinner and stayed until evening, and then she left, and it was that night that Bronzino and I came back to the house to look at the Petrarch, quotes, then sides, stomachs, etc., unquotes, and I paid what had been bet. This means that during the course of the day, during the course of the evening, they'd been arguing over certain lines in Petrarch, which have indeed been identified. It goes, Scylla, Mario, Neron, Gaio e Mezenzio, fianchi stomachi febrio a denti fanno, per la morte amara più che Assenzio. Sulla, Marius, Nero, Caligula, and Mezentius. Then the line they're arguing about, sides, stomachs, and burning fever make death seem more bitter than wormwood. They argue about the fianchi stomachi line and have a bet about it. Bronzino doesn't have a Petrarch in his house for some reason, but Pontormo does. So they go back together to Pontormo's, and it turns out that Pontormo is wrong, and he pays up. So if what we're doing is building up a picture of Bronzino's character through a series of glimpses, we might be forgiving for asking here, if Bronzino loved his Petrarch enough to learn it by heart, how come he didn't have a copy in the house? And the most economical answer would be, he learnt it by heart from Pontormo's copy when he was living with him, so he didn't have to buy a copy for himself. A few weeks later, towards the end of the carnival, Bronzino and Pontormo dined together on rabbit. And Pontormo adds that he saw the jugglers there. By now, this seems typical of Bronzino, that he either suggested, let's go and have a look at the jugglers, or he even laid some on himself to cheer the old man up. Pontormo had every reason to feel a bit low. He was working at the time on the figure of a woman grieving over a dead child, working in daily stages down the woman's body until he reached the dead child. And to cap it all, the weather was terrible, and meat was about to be struck off the menu for Lent. Here's another glimpse, which I found in McCorquodale's book, from a letter of Bronzino's, which is full of flattery of the Duke and his family, particularly the children, whom he's painting at the time in Pisa. He says, when I look at them, I think them so many angels, and when I listen to them, they seem to be spirits from heaven. I'm painting in the room in which they learn Latin and Greek, and I take the utmost pleasure in seeing these tender, well-born plants directed in such a manner that they will yield the happiest fruit. What I meant by the glimpse here is simply the information that he painted the Duke's children in the schoolroom, where they learnt Latin and Greek, amongst, we imagine, whatever books or writing tablets or slates the children of the time used. And he clearly enjoyed the task. The paintings tell us as much, even if we felt that we had to discount some of the courtiers' language. Bronzino never married, and he had no children of his own, but he liked family duties well enough. He had several dependents. When his friend Cristofano Allori died, Bronzino took responsibility for his widow and children, and he brought up the future painter Alessandro Allori very much as his own son, just as he himself had been a sort of son to Pontormo. And Bronzino had a cat with an elegant name, as we learned from Deborah Parker's excellent book on Bronzino as a poet. Deborah is due to speak later, and I hope she won't mind my borrowing this one point about the cat. It was called Corimbo. It's quite a fancy name for a cat. It sounds like the name of some shepherd in a pastoral poem of the period. It's actually a word of Greek origin, meaning corimb, a kind of multiple flower head. So he says, this is Deborah's translation, "You know, Corimbo, that sometimes I read like this in bed in order to fall asleep, or when as now I sit with you at the fire, and you have seen me scribbling on some paper and composing some trifle in order to pass the time and refresh my mind." In other words, the cat shared the domestic solitude he was able to achieve in a house full of dependents. In his chamber, one remembers that there was a kind of room in a Florentine house of the time that was called a bedchamber, but it was far, far more than a bedchamber. In his chamber, Bronzino could be alone in the evening by the fire with his cat, reading or writing poetry. And he wrote two sharply contrasting kinds of poem. In one kind, he was a devoted Petrarchan, and in the other, he delighted in sending up Dante, Petrarch, and everything their poetry stood for. This second mode is known as the burlesque or burnesque, after the poet Francesco Berni, a contemporary of Bronzino's. It's not unlike satirical poetry in the tradition that we know in English, but it has its own special character. The burlesque poem the English reader would be most likely to encounter in translation is the capitolo, or chapter. That's a form in this genre. They're not called satire 1 or satire 2. They're called chapter this, or chapter on this, chapter on that. The capitolo that Benvenuto Cellini composed in prison, which is a poem in praise of prisons. This kind of essay in paradoxical praise for an improbable subject is typical of the burlesque tradition. Bronzino has one in praise of the galley, the humor of which derives in great part, as apparently does much of the humor of burlesque poetry, from sexual double meanings. And again, this is what Deborah is going to talk about. And the striking feature of this burlesque equivocation is its homosexual character. The word galley, for instance, according to the editor of Bronzino's burlesque poetry, denotes the male sexual organ in homosexual activity. The poem says that if you're having a bad time with women, go to the galley and you'll be surprised how quickly you get used to a different sort of, etc., etc., etc. This recurrent homosexual bias in the dialect accounts for a certain amount of the disapproval which Bronzino's work, not just his poetry, but his work as a whole, elicited in the 19th century. And Deborah quotes from John Addington Symonds, who associates Bronzino's barren art, his inexpressibly chilly portraits, with the, quotes, personal corruption, unquotes, that he finds in the poems. A strikingly hypocritical judgment by Symonds, if he means what we think he means. Morality aside, burlesque poetry of the kind that Bronzino wrote is hard to translate. At least I find it hard, impossible, in fact. And I should have thought it was impossible to render into English poetry. Yet it also seems interesting and informative in a way that, say, a satirical piece such as Swift's description of a city shower is interesting, with its realism, even though Swift's primary purpose is not realistic description so much as the sending up of literary convention by yoking an elevated style to a base subject matter. Bronzino has a poem called I Rumori, in which he describes the din being made in the streets around his house by the various tradesmen who work there. And yet his editor tells us that I rumori represent, in burlesque language, an animated sexual relationship contro natura. I might add that even today, not everybody detects the same pervasive obsession with sodomy. For another editor tells us that she does not see in Bronzino's verses any allusion to the sexual act contro natura. She may, of course, subscribe to a different definition of natura from the rest of us. What was against nature was also against the law, and it's worth mentioning finally that burlesque poetry, in which we read so much cheerful reference to and recommendation of transgressive sex, was publishable in its day. Some of Bronzino's work in this vein did get into print, and Vasari thought that the rest should. But there were laws against the act itself, so writing in this way about it was by no means the same as doing it. And perhaps that is the essence of the burlesque equivocation. Thanks very much indeed.